Chapter 1. Warm loaves, cold knives. Dawn came to Grissenhafen the way it always did, late, reluctant, and stained the color of old bruises by the smoke that never quite left the river valley. The town hunched beneath its own grime, roofs slick with soot and last night's rain. Chimneys coughed, barges groaned at their moorings. Somewhere, upriver, a bell tolled the hour with a note like a hammer striking bone. Market morning should have been the town's one honest ritual. Bread, salted fish, onions, cheap charms hammered from tin. It should have been the moment when the poor pretended they weren't, when a warm loaf in the hands could make a man forget for a heartbeat the war taxes, the ration lines, the missing sons. Instead, the square reeked of panic beneath the sweeter smells, hot crust, tallow, wet wool, and the crowd moved with a jitter in its spine, like a dog that keeps hearing something in the dark. The baker's stall was already doing a brisk trade, loaves stacked like small sunlit bricks behind greasy cloth, steam bleeding into the cold air. People elbowed close, coins sweating in their palms. A woman with a shawl torn at the shoulder clutched 2 loaves to her chest as if they were children. A dockhand, broad as a door and twice as ugly, shoved forward with a fistful of coppers and the sour impatience of the hungry. 2 rye, he barked. 3 coppers, the baker said, voice hoarse from shouting over bodies. His apron was flour-stained, but his hands shook like he'd been pulling corpses from the river all night. The dockhand tossed the coins and tore into a heel before he'd even turned away. He chewed fast, greedily, crumbs spraying his beard. His eyes, already red from drink or sleeplessness, seemed to brighten with a wet shine. Beside him, a boy no more than 12 held out a half-coin and looked up with the hard, wary stare of someone who'd learned early that pleading didn't fill bellies. The baker hesitated, glanced toward the ledger under his counter, then shoved a small loaf into the boy's hands like it burned. "Go," he muttered. "Go on, lad." The boy darted away, weaving through skirts and boots. It might have ended there. A morning like any other in a town that didn't deserve better. Then a man laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It was too loud, too sudden, and it came from near the fishmonger's cart, where the river catch lay on ice gone grey. The laugh pitched high, almost shrill, and heads turned in irritation. A cooper stood with a crust in his hand. He stared at it, as if it were a joke only he understood. His lips were damp with grease. Flour clung to his fingers. "Tastes like," he began, and his voice thickened as if his tongue had swollen. He blinked. Again. His pupils were too wide. The cooper's grin twitched at the corners, then broke, and he coughed a hard bark that spat crumbs and saliva onto the cobbles. When he lifted his head, his face had changed. Not in any way you could name cleanly, no mutation, no obvious monstrousness, but the muscles around his eyes had pulled tight, and his jaw jutted forward like he was about to bite. A woman near him, older, pinched cheeks. A basket of turnips wrinkled her nose. "You drunk already?" she snapped. The cooper turned his head slowly. He stared at her, and something in that stare made the woman take half a step back. It was not anger exactly. It was hunger, sharpened to a knife point. The cooper's nostrils flared as if he could smell her fear. Then he struck. His fist cracked into her mouth with a sound like a butcher splitting a joint. Teeth sprayed white and bright and wrong against the muddy stones. The woman fell, without a cry, hands clawing at nothing. For a heartbeat the market froze. 1,000 people held the same breath. The cooper stood over the fallen woman, chest heaving, and a string of saliva dangled from his lower lip. He looked down as if surprised by what he'd done. Then his face twisted, half grimace, half laugh. The fishmonger surged forward, knife in hand. What in Zigmas? The cooper whirled, faster than a sane man should. He lunged, not for the knife, but for the fishmonger's face. Fingers spread like claws. The fishmonger tried to back away, slipped on ice melt, and the cooper drove him into the cart. Fish tumbled, ice shattered. The knife clattered to the ground. The cooper bit. He sank his teeth into the fishmonger's ear and tore back with the savage strength of a starving dog. Flesh ripped. The fishmonger screamed a thin, tearing sound that cut through the market like a whip. Blood sheeted down his neck, bright and steaming in the cold. And then the market exploded. A man shouted, "Witchcraft!" and threw a rotten apple. Someone else bellowed, "Plague!" and shoved forward, knocking a child down. A woman began to sob and laugh at the same time, her hands fluttering uselessly over her face. The dockhand who'd eaten first stood rigid for a moment, chewing slowly, eyes fixed on the blood. Then his lips peeled back from his teeth. He drove his elbow into the ribs of the man beside him, an old veteran with a cap badge tarnished to green. And when the veteran doubled over, the dockhand grabbed the veteran's head and smashed it into the edge of the baker's stall. Wood splintered. The veteran's skull made a dull, wet thump. The baker screamed, "Stop! Stop!" and reached for something beneath his counter. A boy, maybe the same one with the loaf, ran through the chaos, clutching his bread like treasure. He tripped over a fallen basket, and the loaf skidded across the stones. He scrambled after it, snatched it up, and immediately shoved a chunk into his mouth, eyes wide, terrified, and ravenous. His mother, if she was his mother, grabbed his collar and yanked him upright. "Don't eat," she began. The boy convulsed so hard his spine arched like a bow. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. A foam bubbled at his lips, thick with crumbs. He made a sound, half whisper, half wheeze, that didn't fit in a child's throat. "So hot," he rasped, and his fingers clawed at his own cheeks as if he were trying to peel his skin off. His mother screamed and tried to hold him. The boy's head snapped toward her with a speed that made her flinch, and his teeth clicked together like a trap. He bit down on her wrist. She shrieked. He clung like a leech, jaw working, and blood poured between his lips. His mother struck him with her free hand, again and again, sobbing as she did it, but he didn't let go until someone grabbed him by the hair and threw him bodily into a stack of crates. The crowd surged away from him, tripping and trampling. A cart overturned. A barrel rolled, spilling stale ale into the gutter. In the crush, someone fell beneath boots and did not rise again. Fire bloomed near the clothier's stall. It began as a flicker an oil lamp knocked onto straw. A length of oiled canvas caught and curled. The flame found dry reeds and hungry wood, and in moments the stall was a torch, the canvas roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. The heat drove people back, but the violence drove them forward. Panic turned the square into a grinder. Across the square, a man in a long black coat pushed through the chaos with the calm purpose of a blade sliding from a sheath. Conrad Vel did not run. He did not shout. He moved, with the measured stride of someone who'd walked through worse than riot, worse than fire, worse than fear. His hat brim was low enough to shadow his eyes, but the torchlight caught the pale scar that split his cheek and the silver buckle at his throat, marked with the twin-tailed comet of Sigmar's cult. A pistol sat heavy at his hip, and the leather of his coat was stained dark in places where rain hadn't washed old blood. He stopped near the fallen veteran at the baker's stall. He knelt with the ease of habit, fingers quick and clinical as a surgeon's. The veteran's eyes stared sightlessly at the smoky sky, one cheek crushed inward, the skull broken like an egg. Conrad looked at the splintered wood, the angle of the corpse, the arc of blood. He glanced up at the dockhand, who was now wrestling with a fish crate like it had personally insulted him. Not madness, not ordinary drunken rage. Conrad's nostrils flared. He caught the smell, yeast and smoke, yes, but beneath it something faint and wrong, like cold iron ground to powder. He rose and stepped into the riot. A man swung a cudgel at him. Conrad caught the cudgel on his forearm, twisted, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. The man gagged, eyes bulging, and dropped to his knees. Conrad didn't finish him. He moved past, like the man was already dead. Near the center of the square, two women clawed at each other's faces, shrieking. One had a crust jammed between her teeth, chewing even as she screamed. Conrad grabbed the chewing woman by the hair and yanked her backward. She snarled and snapped at him. He slammed her head into a water trough, once, twice. The second impact stunned her long enough for him to haul her away from the other woman and shove her down. "Water," he barked at a bystander who looked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. "Pour. Keep her head down." The bystander fumbled, then obeyed, dumping water over the woman's face. She sputtered, choking, and began to weep, her fury leaking away into confusion. Conrad's eyes swept the square. He read it the way others read scripture signs and patterns, causes and consequences. Those who had eaten were wrong, not simply frightened. Their movements had a vicious urgency, their eyes too bright, their skin flushed, their tongues seemed too thick in their mouths, speech slurred and fragmented. Some laughed, some cried. All of them struck like animals. Food. Always the food. A cry rose above the din. "There! The miller!" Conrad followed the pointing hands, and the wave of anger like a scent. At the edge of the square, half a dozen townsfolk had dragged a woman forward by her arms. She stumbled, boots scraping, a smear of flour on her cheek like a priest's ash mark turned inside out. Lisa Kappel's hair had come loose from its tie, strands stuck to sweat on her temples. She fought them, not with flailing desperation, but with the stubborn fury of someone used to hauling sacks twice her weight. One man had his fingers twisted in her sleeve. She drove her elbow into his ribs and hissed a curse. "Your flour did this," a woman screamed, spittle flying. "Kappel's mill! Kappel's bread! Rot grain witch!" another shouted. Someone threw a heel of bread at her. It struck her shoulder and fell, and a man snatched it up and crammed it into his mouth, chewing like he meant to eat his own hand next. Lisa's eyes flicked to the burning stall, to the blood on the stones, to the writhing boy, and her face tightened with horror. "I didn't," she began. "I swear by—" A fist came from the side and struck her jaw. Her head snapped back. She tasted blood. Conrad stepped between her and the crowd, like a door slamming shut. "Enough," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. It had that quality of authority that didn't ask permission to exist. The man who'd hit Lies blinked up at him, breath steaming, knuckles red. Who? 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 Conrad lifted his coat just enough for the pistol to show, just enough for the silver sigil to catch the firelight. The man's mouth went dry. The crowd's noise faltered, not from respect but from that instinctive animal caution. The predator has entered the yard. A witch hunter, someone whispered, as if saying it too loudly would summon another. Conrad didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. He looked at Lise, then at the bread scattered across the stones, trampled into mud and blood. "Your name," he said to her, as if they were alone. She swallowed, jaw trembling. "Lise Capel. You run the mill." "My family does. Yes." Her voice tried to steady itself, and failed. "You sold flour to the bakers?" "Yes." "Same as always." Conrad nodded once, as if filing it away. A child's scream cut through the lull. The boy who'd convulsed had staggered upright. His face was slick with sweat, eyes unfocused, and his mouth moved as if chewing words. He stumbled toward the crowd, arms out like a sleepwalker reaching for warmth. His mother lunged to grab him again. He turned and struck her with the back of his hand, hard enough to send her sprawling. Then he fell on her, not as a son but as a creature, and his fingers dug into her hair and pulled until she cried out. Conrad moved. He crossed the distance in a few long steps. He caught the boy by the collar, hauled him off the woman, and held him up. The boy's legs kicked, feet scraping air. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he whispered, breath hot on Conrad's wrist, "Ashes." In the bread, his tongue was coated gray at the edges, like soot smeared over raw flesh. Conrad's jaw tightened. He lowered the boy gently, almost gently, and then struck him sharply at the side of the neck. The boy went limp, a puppet whose strings had been cut. Conrad laid him down and pressed 2 fingers to his pulse. Rapid, fever-fast. He stood and looked back at the market. Fire crackled. People screamed. The air swam with smoke and flour dust. Somewhere, someone prayed loudly to Sigmar, the words tumbling over each other like dice. Somewhere else, someone laughed and laughed until it became a sob. Conrad reached into his coat and drew out a small leather pouch, a stoppered vial, and a thin-bladed knife whose edge had seen too much. He crouched by a smashed loaf and scraped a portion into the vial. He took a pinch of flour from a baker's spilled sack and sealed it. He scraped at the underside of a cart where millstone dust had gathered and took that too. Lies hovered a step away, eyes wide, hands trembling. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice small beneath the chaos. "Proving," Conrad said. His gaze didn't leave the samples. "Or condemning." He stood, capped the vial, and looked at her properly then. His eyes were hard and pale, the color of river ice that never quite melts. "This is contamination," he said, but his tone was all the certainty of someone naming a corpse. Lise latched onto the word like a rope. "Yes, rot grain," I told. Conrad's eyes slid to the boy's gray-smeared tongue, to the dockhand still raging with a fish crate, to the way the violence spread fastest among those with crumbs on their lips. "No," he said quietly, "not just rot. And in that pause, in the fraction of a second before the market noise surged again, Lise heard what he didn't say. Corruption. By noon, the square was a charnel yard. The fire had been beaten down with buckets and piss and desperation, leaving blackened timbers and a stench of burnt cloth. Bodies lay under tarps, or not at all. Blood had dried in dark fans across the stones. The magistrates' men arrived too late and too thin, their breastplates dented and their faces pale. They tried to restore order with clubs and threats, and for a while it worked, until a man with flour on his beard tried to bite one of them. Conrad watched it all, with the patience of someone measuring a noose. He took Lise from the square under the thin shield of his authority, walking her through alleys where the walls sweated mildew and the gutters ran with filth. Her mill sat at the edge of the water, a squat building of old stone and newer repairs, its wheel turning slow in the brown river. Flour dust clung to everything, sills, beams, ropes, like a fine winter that never ended. "This is where it began," Conrad said. Lisa's mouth worked. "I don't understand. I've milled the same way my father did. We'll see," Conrad said. He left her there, under the watch of a thin-faced Templar, Brother Sergeant Holtz. If the man had bothered to introduce himself properly and went into the mill's belly, where the air was thick and the machinery groaned like something alive, he ran his fingers along the chute, along the stone, along the wooden bins. He sniffed the dust. He tasted it on the tip of his tongue and spat it once, as if the very idea offended him. Night fell like a wet cloak. Christenhafen's streets emptied early, not from discipline but from fear. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Even the taverns grew quiet, their laughter strangled by the day's memory. Smoke from the burned stall still hung over the town, mixing with the river fog until the world felt half drowned. Behind Capel's mill, the shadows were deeper. The river whispered against stone, carrying the stink of rot and old secrets. A single lantern burned by the back door, its flame guttering in the wind. Conrad stood in that darkness and waited. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. Predators announce themselves only when they want prey to run. Footsteps came soft over wet earth. A shape moved along the mill wall, small, hunched, cautious. The figure held something close to the chest, a bundle wrapped in cloth. Conrad watched the figure reach the lantern. He watched the cloth bundle shift. He saw the glint of a tinderbox. The would-be arsonist didn't get the chance to strike a spark. Conrad stepped out of the dark and slammed the figure into the wall hard enough to rattle the lantern hook. The flame flared, throwing light over a face slick with sweat and eyes too bright. It was a man in a dockworker's coat. His cheeks were flushed. His lips were cracked and stained. He tried to snarl, but the sound came out wrong, wet and thick. Conrad seized his jaw and forced his mouth open. The man's tongue was blackened along the edges, gray-black, like ash mixed into meat. It looked as if he'd been licking chimney soot. The man bucked and spat, flecks of gray clinging to Conrad's glove. Conrad's expression didn't change. He drove his fist into the man's gut. The man folded with a wheeze, his breath exploding out in a cloud that stank faintly of metal and smoke. "Who sent you?" Conrad said, voice low. The man giggled. It was the same shrill note the cooper had made in the market, the laugh of something too hot inside the skull. Conrad hooked a hand into the man's coat and wrenched it open. His fingers found the inner pocket, tore it out, and spilled its contents into his palm. Coins. Not copper, not clipped silver, Not worn brass from 100 transactions. These were perfect, sharp-edged, clean, stamped with a merchant's mark so crisp it looked newly minted. Guild scrip, the kind used to pay quietly, to purchase silence, to keep honest men hungry and dishonest men fat. Conrad let the coins fall one by one back into his palm, listening to the soft clink as if it were a prayer. He looked at the man's glassy eyes, at the ash-stained tongue, at the tinderbox and shaking hands. Then he turned his gaze to the dark river beyond the mill, where barges moved like shadows carrying the town's lifeblood, grain, flour, money, lies. Not rot, Conrad murmured to himself. Behind him, the man tried to twist away, teeth snapping. Conrad tightened his grip until bone creaked. "Speak," he said, "or I'll peel the truth out of you." The man's mouth opened. Gray spittle slid down his chin. His pupils trembled like they were trying to escape his skull. And somewhere, in the mill's shadowed timbers, something small skittered, just the sound of flour settling, perhaps, or something listening. Chapter 2. Rot, Lies, and River Mist. Morning in Grissenhafen did not cleanse anything. It only revealed what the night had hidden. The soot smeared higher on walls where rain had run, the scorch marks on the market stones, the dark clots in the gutter where blood had cooled and thickened, the handprints on shutters where someone had tried to climb, or tried to flee, or tried to drag a screaming body away from the fire. The river mist rolled in low and greasy, flattening sound and swallowing distance. Bells rang for the dead, slow, tired strokes that felt less like mourning than accountancy. When the wind shifted, it carried the stench of burnt canvas from the square and the sharper bite of lye where the magistrate's men had scrubbed in vain. Conrad Vel stood beneath the eaves of Kappel's mill and watched a pair of town watchmen haul yesterday's would-be arsonist across the yard by the wrists. The man's boots cut furrows in the mud. His head lolled and then snapped up, eyes wild, as if he remembered the world and hated it. He wore a gag. It was not for mercy. It was because Conrad had seen what came out of his mouth when he laughed. Gray spit, crumbs, a faint metallic reek that clung to the air like a bad confession. Conrad had ordered the gag soaked in vinegar and salt and jammed in hard enough to tear at the corners of the man's lips. It had done nothing to his eyes. Lise Capel stood in the mill doorway, arms folded tight across her chest as if she could squeeze the fear back into her bones. She looked like she had not slept. Flour dust clung to her hairline and a bruise on her jaw had gone the color of storm clouds. Brother Sergeant Holtz lurked a step behind her, helmet under one arm. His shaved scalp gleamed with damp. The hammer badge at his throat caught the weak daylight, bright as a promise. He watched the prisoner with the hunger of a man who liked simple answers: rope, fire, ash, anything that meant he didn't have to think. "Hang him in the square," Holtz said, voice flat and certain. "Let the people see what comes of wickedness." Conrad did not look at him. He watched the prisoner's feet drag through the mud and noted the trembling in his ankles, the jerky tension of muscles that never quite relaxed. "Wickedness?" Conrad said. "He was paid." Holtz's jaw tightened. Paid by whom? The miller? A rival? A witch? Lies flinched at the word as if it were a slap. "I didn't." Sigmar's breath. "I didn't." Conrad finally turned. His gaze slid over Holtz like a blade testing armor. "Not your business yet," he said. "Not until it's proven." Holtz's nostrils flared. "Proven, proven, always proven. The town is boiling, witch hunter. People were tearing at each other's throats yesterday. If there is corruption, you scour it out. You don't weigh it on a merchant scale." Conrad stepped close enough that Holtz could smell the leather of his coat and the faint tang of black powder. "You want a purge," Conrad said softly. "A quick fire, a crowd roaring, and a feeling that you did something righteous." Holtz bristled, shoulders squaring. "I want order." "You want applause," Conrad replied. "And you'll get bodies instead. There's a difference." The Templar's knuckles whitened around his helmet rim. He looked at Lise as if she were a convenient torch. Conrad's voice hardened. "No burnings, no accusations shouted in public. You don't drag the town into a frenzy because your faith is bored." Holtz's eyes flashed. For a moment Conrad thought the man might actually draw steel. Then the Templar swallowed it down with visible effort, jaw working. "As you command," Holtz said. Though the words tasted like rust, Conrad let him simmer. He had seen zealots before, men who would set a city on fire to roast one rat. Useful in a siege, deadly in a street. The prisoner was taken inside, down into the mill's lower room where the stones sat like pale moons, and where the air was always thick with flour and damp wood. Conrad followed Lise into her cramped office, a table scarred by years of ledger work, a shelf of stamped weights, a small shrine of hammered iron where Sigmar's twin-tailed comet hung above a candle stub. "Show me," Conrad said. Lise swallowed. Her hands trembled as she dragged a heavy book from beneath the table. The ledger thumped down like a judge's gavel. She flipped pages with stiff fingers, ink smudged and raw around the nails. Names and numbers marched in tight lines, grain deliveries, sack counts, payments. Beside each entry were marks burned into the paper, little brands made with heated iron, the kind suppliers use to certify a load. "My supply's been clean for years," she said, voice strained but stubborn. "Hergold's farmsteads upriver, old families, same fields, same wagons, same marks." She stabbed a finger at a row of entries. "See, the crescent and 3 dots. That's Hergold's. Been on every shipment since my father's time." Conrad leaned over the ledger, eyes scanning with the patient speed of someone used to finding lies in ink. The marks were consistent, the dates regular, the sack weights normal. No sudden spike, no strange gap, no sign of missing inventory that would hint at a swap. "Delivery marks can be copied," Conrad said. Lise snapped. "Not that cleanly, not without the irons. And if someone stole Hergold's irons, Hergold would be screaming it from the rooftops." Conrad tapped a page with one gloved finger. "Who else has access to your sacks? Your bins?" "No one," she said, too quickly. Conrad's eyes lifted. Lisa's mouth tightened. She breathed in, then out. "The bakers," she admitted. "They send carts. They load from the front bins when I'm busy. But I watch. I'm not careless." Conrad closed the ledger. "Careless isn't required," he said. "Only an open moment." He took his pouch of samples from inside his coat and set it on the table. The vials clinked softly. Lise stared at them as if they were teeth. "What is it?" she asked. "Proof or a noose," Conrad said. He unstoppered the vial of flour, dipped a clean knife tip into it, and brought it near his nose. He inhaled slow, controlled. Yeast, grain, stone dust, and beneath it, faint as a memory, the cold iron note he'd caught in the square. He stoppered it again. "We go to the granaries," he said. The riverside granaries squatted like fat insects along the wharf. Long wooden buildings raised on thick posts, their sides patched with tar and nailed planks. Rats lived in the spaces between boards, bold as thieves. The river lapped beneath, dark and slow, carrying driftwood and the occasional pale shape that might have been a pig carcass or might have been something else. Conrad walked the planks with Holtz at his shoulder and 2 watchmen trailing like nervous dogs. Lise came behind, hood up, trying to make herself small. She failed. People noticed her. They always would now. A miller's name, once just a trade, had become a curse in a single morning. Inside the granary, the air was damp and sour. Stacks of sacks rose like tombstones. Grain spilled in drifts along the floor, crunching under boots. A clerk with ink-stained fingers met them with a face like wet parchment. "Warehouse manifest says," the clerk began. Conrad shoved his sigil toward the man's nose. "I don't care what your manifest says," he cut in. "Show me the latest delivery." The clerk blinked, swallowed, and led them between stacks. A pair of dockers hefted sacks in silence, eyes flicking toward Conrad and away again. In one corner, grain sat in a bin golden brown, but mottled with darker patches. It smelled of damp hay and the faint, sweet rot of fungus. Conrad plunged his gloved hand into it. Kernels slid between his fingers. Some were firm, some collapsed into dust. He brought a handful up and let it trickle back down, watching the texture. "Rot," Holtz said, satisfied. "There, the cause. Burn it." Conrad ignored him. He leaned closer, plucked out a cluster of gray-flecked kernels, crushed them between his fingers. The rot was real mildew, moisture, bad storage, enough to make folk ill, enough to make bellies twist and heads ache, not enough to make men bite ears off. He straightened and looked at the sacks. "Those marks," he said. The clerk swallowed. "Upstream farms. Hergold, like always." "Oh!" Conrad walked the row, reading the brands like a script. Crescent, 3 dots. Crescent, 3 dots. All consistent, all old. He stopped at a sack that had been restitched clumsily along one seam. The thread was new, pale against the darker burlap. Conrad's fingers pressed the seam. Something crunched oddly inside, not like grain. He slit the thread with his knife, just enough to open a gap, and reached in. His fingers brushed kernels, and then a small waxy lump. Conrad pulled it out. A blob of hardened wax, stamped faintly with a merchant's sigil. "Not a farm's mark, a guild's." Holtz leaned in, eyes narrowing. "What is that?" Conrad's gaze sharpened. "Someone opened this sack and sealed it again," he said. "Not a farmer." The clerk's face drained. "That's impossible. Only the guild warehouse." Conrad's head snapped toward him. "Only the guild warehouse handles resealing," the clerk stammered, realizing his mistake. "For inspection? For—" Conrad cut him off. "Where is the grain carter who brought the last load to Cappel's mill?" The clerk licked his lips. "Jost, I think. Jost Rannick. He drinks at the Pike and Gaff, dockside." Conrad turned, coat swinging. "Then we go dockside. The docks were worse than the market. The river made men hard and made their morals soft. Fish guts and tar and piss soaked into every plank. Nets hung like dead skin from posts. Gull cries pierced the fog and then vanished, swallowed by the mist. The Pike and Gaff was a low building with a roof that sagged like a tired brow. Smoke seeped from its windows. Inside, the air was warm with bodies and sour ale. Men hunched over cups, eyes tracking Conrad with the wary stillness of animals watching a hunter. Jost Rannick sat near the back, nursing a drink with both hands. He was a broad-shouldered carter with hands like shovels and a face carved by weather. His eyes darted at Conrad's sigil, and then at Holtz's hammer badge, and fear tightened his mouth. "I didn't do nothing," Jost blurted before Conrad even spoke. Conrad sat across from him without invitation. The bench creaked. "You hauled grain to Kappel's mill," he said. Jost swallowed. "Aye, like I always do, from Herrgård's." "Aye, eh?" Conrad leaned forward. "Did your sacks ever leave your sight?" Jost's eyes flicked toward the tavern door, toward the fog beyond. "No," he said. "Too fast." Conrad's voice went soft. "Lie, again." Jost's hands tightened around his cup. They stopped me," he whispered. "Who?" Jost's throat worked. "Ashmen." The word hung in the air like a bad smell. A couple of men at the bar went suddenly still. Someone coughed too loudly. Conrad's gaze didn't waver. "Tell me." Jost swallowed hard. "Dock boys. Used to be just a gang. Fights, theft, that sort. But lately they're organized. Like they got coin. Like they got someone telling 'em where to be." He stared into his drink as if it might drown him. "They stopped my wagon by the warehouse district. Said it was inspection," Holtz hissed. "Then why didn't you report it?" Jost flinched. "Because they had knives," he snapped, then lowered his voice. "And because they had papers. Guild papers. His Olvus. Knives." Conrad's spine went cold. "What did they do?" Jost's mouth opened, closed. He looked up, eyes wet with shame. "They cut open a sack, just one, dug around, put something in." He shook his head violently. "Not much. A pinch, maybe. Gray dust, like fireplace ash, but finer. Then they stitched it, and Sigmar helped me pressed wax on it with a seal. Like it was proper." Conrad's mind clicked. Not rot. Rot as camouflage. Rot as excuse. A pinch in one sack could spread through a mill's bins like blasphemy through a prayer hall. Holtz surged forward, grabbing Jost's collar. "Name them," he growled. "I'll drag them into the square myself." Conrad caught Holtz's wrist and twisted just enough to make the Templar release with a grunt. "Not yet," Conrad said. Holtz glared. "They're poisoning the town. And if you run shouting about gangs and guild seals without proof, the guild will bury this," Conrad replied. "They'll call it slander. They'll buy the magistrate. They'll hang the wrong men. And the ash will keep moving." Jost's breathing hitched. "They'll kill me," he whispered. "They'll—" A shadow moved outside the tavern window. Conrad's gaze flicked. Fog pressed against the glass like a dirty hand. A shape passed quick, low, then another. The room's warmth suddenly felt like a trap. Conrad stood. "Out the back," he ordered. Jost blinked. "What?" Conrad grabbed him by the sleeve. "Now!" They shoved through the tavern's rear door into an alley that reeked of stale fish and old piss. Mist curled around their knees. The river's breath was cold here, wetting the skin. Somewhere nearby, a gull screamed and fell silent abruptly, as if its throat had been pinched shut. Footsteps slapped on planks. A whisper of laughter Thin, hungry, wrong. The ashmen came out of the fog like a sickness surfacing. 3 at first, then more, faces half hidden by scarves, eyes shining too bright. Dock knives flashed. One carried a short club studded with nails. Another had a hook like a butcher's. "Witch hunter," one called, voice slurred, amused. "You ask too many questions." Conrad drew his pistol in one smooth motion. The weapon looked small in his hand, but the muzzle was black as a confession. "Back," Conrad said. The ashman laughed. His teeth were grey at the edges. They rushed anyway. Conrad fired once. The pistol cracked like thunder in the fog. An ashman jerked back as the shot took him high in the chest, blood spraying in a fine mist that vanished into the mist around it. He fell without a sound, collapsing like a sack of meal. The others did not stop. Holtz roared a prayer and charged, drawing his sword. Steel flashed and met a dock knife with a shriek. Holtz drove the point through a man's shoulder and kicked him away. The man screamed, then laughed, clutching the wound as if it pleased him. Conrad shoved Jost behind a stack of fish crates and stepped into the alley's mouth like a gatekeeper. An ashman swung a nail club at his head. Conrad ducked, the club whistling overhead, and drove his knee into the man's groin. The man's face contorted pain, yes, but also a strange delight. He spat grey saliva and lunged again. Conrad drew his blade and cut low, slicing hamstring. The ashman went down, shrieking, hands clawing at the cobbles. Conrad stepped on his wrist and pressed down until bones cracked like kindling. Another ashman came from the side, hook aimed for Conrad's ribs. Conrad twisted, felt the hook tear leather and scrape along bone. Heat flared. He grunted and slammed the pistol butt into the attacker's face. Teeth shattered. Blood sprayed. The man staggered back, eyes rolling. Lice appeared at the alley entrance she'd followed, despite Sen snatching up a broken oar like a cudgel. She swung it into an ashman's knee. The man collapsed and snapped his teeth at her, trying to bite her calf. She screamed and smashed his head again and again until he lay still, twitching. The fight was ugly, close and wet. Knives slipped in and out of flesh. Breath came in harsh gasps that steamed in the fog. Conrad's coat grew heavy with rain and blood. Somewhere, a fishmonger's bell rang wildly. Alarm or madness, it didn't matter. The ashmen began to falter only when they realized Conrad wasn't running and Holtz wasn't dying quickly enough. One backed away, dragging a wounded companion by the collar, eyes wide and feral. "You can't touch the warehouse," he hissed. "Gild'll hang you." "Gild'll?" Conrad fired again. The shot clipped the man's ear, tearing it. The ashman screamed and vanished into the fog, leaving a trail of blood like breadcrumbs. Silence fell, broken only by distant shouting and the river's slow slap against pilings. Conrad turned to Jost. The carter sat hunched behind the crates, hands pressed to his belly. For a heartbeat, Conrad thought he'd simply soiled himself in fear. Then Conrad saw the blood. A knife blade jutted from Jost's gut, buried to the hilt. The handle trembled with each ragged breath. Someone had struck him in the chaos. Clean, practiced, not a wild slash. A message delivered under cover of fog. Jost's face was grey now, sweat beading on his brow. His eyes found Conrad's with desperate clarity. Conrad knelt. He gripped the handle. "Not pulling, never pull, not unless you want the bleeding faster." He pressed cloth against the wound, but blood seeped through in steady pulses, warm and unstoppable. "No," Lies whispered. horrified. No, no. Holtz stood over them, chest heaving, eyes blazing. Let him die, he snarled. Then we burn the docks, burn the gang, burn the warehouse, burn. Conrad shot him a look sharp enough to cut steel. Quiet. Jost's lips trembled. He swallowed, and blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. Warehouse, he rasped. Conrad leaned in. Yes, guild seals, Jost whispered, each word a struggle, as if he had to drag them up from mud. His fingers clutched Conrad's sleeve with surprising strength. Not grain. Conrad's jaw clenched. Then what? Jost's eyes fluttered. He coughed, and red sprayed Conrad's glove. His voice dropped to a breath, but the words landed like stones. Casks, he rasped. Not grain, casks. His grip loosened. His head lolled to one side. The fog curled around his face like a shroud. Conrad stared down at him for a long moment, listening to the river, to the distant panic, to the small ticking of his own mind, assembling the pieces into something ugly. Casks meant cargo. Casks meant warehouses. Casks meant guild hands, guild paper, guild power. He stood slowly, as if rising would pull the town's weight onto his shoulders. Holtz's voice came tight and eager. Now you have your proof. Conrad looked at the dead Carter, at the grey-stained teeth of the fallen ashmen, at the fog swallowing the end of the alley. No, Conrad said, and his voice was cold enough to frost glass. Now I have my direction. He turned toward the warehouse district where the mist thickened and the guild's banners hung clean and bright above filthy streets, as if cloth could hide rot. Behind him, the river breathed. Ahead, the town waited to be swallowed. Chapter 3. The Warehouse with the Iron Smile. The Merchant Guild district sat apart from Grissenhafen the way a fat leech sits apart from the blood it drinks, attached, indispensable, and smug about it. A high palisade of sharpened timbers and rusted iron brackets fenced the warehouses from the rest of the river town. Lanterns burned in iron cages atop posts, their flames steady despite the wind, fed by oil too clean and too plentiful to be local. The cobbles inside the gate were swept, the gutters ran clear. The stink of fish and piss that defined the docks faded to a distant ghost, replaced by tar, rope, and the sour-sweet smell of wealth. Spices sealed in crates, wine sweating in barrels, wool packed tight and dry. Men with cudgels guarded the gate, but the cudgels were mostly for show. The real weapons here were parchment, wax seals, and the quiet threat of who owned the magistrate's debts. Conrad Vel approached at midday, with his hat brim low and his coat buttoned tight over the bandage wrapped around his ribs. The hook scratch from the alley fight had bled enough to make the cloth stick to him in a slow, angry crust. He felt every breath as a tug. Pain was useful. It kept him awake. Lise Kappel walked at his side, hood up, jaw bruised, hands clenched. She'd insisted on coming. Not because she was brave, though she had that stubborn kind of courage that came from hauling sacks and burying pride, but because the town had already decided she was guilty. If she stayed home, they'd come for her in the dark. If she went with Conrad, at least she'd die near the truth. Brother Sergeant Holtz followed behind them, a step too close, eyes too bright. He'd spent the night pacing, muttering prayers, polishing his sword until the edge gleamed like a grin. Conrad could feel his impatience, like a knife, at the base of his neck. At the gate, the guard straightened. One lifted a hand. Papers. Conrad produced his sigil and a folded writ authority, inked in official script and stamped with a hammer mark. The guard took it with the careful respect of a man handling a venomous snake. He read. His eyes flicked to Conrad's face, then away. "This district is guild property," he said, voice stiff. "You want to file a—" Conrad's gloved fingers tapped the sigil. "I'm not filing anything," he said. "I'm investigating a matter of public safety and suspected heresy." The word heresy made the guard's throat tighten. It always did. Heresy was the one thing money couldn't fully buy off, not if it got loud enough, not if it attracted the wrong attention. Still, the guard hesitated. "You'll need a guild factor to—" A coin appeared in Conrad's hand. Not guild scrip. Real silver. Old. Worn. Honest. He flicked it into the guard's palm. The guard's fingers closed on it by reflex. Conrad leaned closer, voice low. "Open the gate," he said, "or I raise my voice loudly. About ash in the bread." The guard's face shifted, fear and calculation wrestling. Then his shoulders sagged. He stepped back and signaled. The gate creaked open. Inside, the district was a maze of long sheds and tall stacked buildings, each marked with a painted symbol. Grain, salt, cloth, iron. Narrow lanes ran between them, patrolled by men in leather caps carrying ledgers and cudgels. Wagons rolled through at a steady pace, wheels oiled, horses fed. Everything moved like clockwork. Everything looked clean, too clean. Conrad watched the workers' faces as they passed. He saw the way they avoided eye contact when his sigil flashed. He saw the way a clerk hurried away with a bundle of papers pressed to his chest like a shield. He saw a pair of guards shift to block a side alley, casual as if they were simply standing in the shade. Liza's breath came shallow. "They're watching us," she whispered. "They always were," Conrad said. They reached the central office, a squat building with a stone foundation and thick wooden doors banded with iron. A brass plaque glinted above the entry. San and Co. Factorage. An office boy tried to stop them. Holtz's hand on his sword hilt ended that conversation without a word. Inside, the air smelled of ink, wax, and polished wood. The floors were swept so clean they looked scrubbed with lye. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with bound ledgers in neat rows. A clerk sat at a high desk, quill poised, eyes flicking like a rat. "Name and business," the clerk said, voice too smooth. Conrad placed his sigil on the desk and let it clink against the wood. "Conrad Vel," he said. "Business is finding who is poisoning the town." The clerk's smile froze. "The guild takes accusations seriously, sir. There are proper channels." "Then fetch your factor," Conrad said. "Or I'll start knocking down doors until I find him." The clerk hesitated only long enough to decide that Conrad meant it. He vanished through a side door. A moment later, Roderick San appeared. He was not tall, but he carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. His hair was dark and slicked back, his beard trimmed to a sharp line. His coat was fine wool, dyed a deep burgundy that looked almost black in this light. Rings glinted on his fingers, tasteful, expensive, the kind that said, "I can afford to look modest." His smile was practiced, polite, warm, like a hearth, cold, like iron. "Witch Hunter Vel," he said, as if they were old acquaintances. "Word travels fast in Grissenhafen. I heard there was unpleasantness in the market. Conrad watched him carefully. Men like San did not panic. They redirected. There were deaths, Conrad said. And there is a pattern. San's eyes softened. Tragic, truly. We at the Guild value stability. Trade thrives when people are calm. He spread his hands. How may I assist you? Conrad gestured faintly toward Lise. The town is blaming her mill. I'm here because I believe the flour is being cut. San's eyebrows rose, just a fraction. Cut? With what? Whoa, cut, grey ash, Conrad said. San let the word settle, then chuckled softly, as if it were an absurd rumor. Ash? In flour? You must understand how that sounds. It sounds like murder, Conrad replied. San's smile did not slip, but something tightened behind it. The Merchant Guild does not tolerate tampering with goods. Our reputation is our livelihood. If you have evidence, witch hunter, present it through proper channels. We will conduct an internal review. Conrad leaned forward. Internal. San's gaze stayed steady. Of course. These matters require discretion. Public alarm harms everyone. Holtz stepped forward, voice sharp. Public alarm is already here. The dockside is full of corpses. Your discretion can choke on it. San's eyes flicked to Holtz with mild irritation, like a man noticing a fly. Templars, he said pleasantly, always so eager to simplify the world into fire and ash. Conrad held up a hand, silencing Holtz. He looked at San. I want access to your grain and flour inventories, he said. Now. San's smile widened, just enough to show teeth. That is irregular. Conrad's voice went colder. So is violence triggered by bread. San leaned back, fingers steepled. Witch hunter, you must understand something. This district is governed by charter. The guild answers to provincial authorities. You may have a sigil, but you are not a magistrate. If you overstep, Conrad cut him off. If I overstep, you'll file complaints, summon lawyers, delay. Meanwhile, people die. San's eyes narrowed a hair's breadth. Meanwhile, trade suffers, he corrected softly. There it was. Not grief, not outrage, not fear of corruption, only fear of loss. Conrad straightened. Walk me through your flour handling, he said. San's smile returned, polished and bright. Gladly. Transparency is the guild's shield. He rose and led them out through a side door into a warehouse corridor. Clerks scurried ahead, opening doors, whispering. San walked with the confidence of a man touring his own temple. He entered a long warehouse where flour sacks were stacked in high, tidy walls, too tidy, each stack aligned with obsessive precision, each sack stamped with a clean mark. The air was thick with flour dust, but the floor was swept, leaving only faint white footprints. Conrad's eyes moved over the stacks. Flour sacks should slump, they should bulge, they should settle unevenly under their own weight. These were arranged like bricks, beautifully kept, San said, pride in his tone. We run a disciplined operation. Conrad walked along the stacks, trailing his fingers lightly over the burlap. His mind counted without effort. Stack heights, sack numbers, a pattern of gaps where sacks had been moved and replaced. Your inventory rotates quickly, Conrad said. San's smile stayed. We value freshness. Conrad stopped at a ledger station where a clerk stood rigid, quill shaking. The clerk's book lay open to a page filled with neat columns. Conrad pointed. This tally is wrong. The clerk's throat bobbed. Sir, San stepped in smoothly. Accounting errors happen. Paper is... Conrad's hand slammed down on the ledger. The sound cracked in the quiet warehouse like a gunshot. The clerk flinched so hard ink splattered. This error, Conrad said, voice low, only exists to hide movement. San's smile finally cooled. You are making assumptions. Conrad leaned closer to the ledger, eyes scanning. Flour shipments out to bakeries, millers, merchants, dates, times, a repeating pattern of small losses and adjustments, always tied to the same storage zone. Conrad looked up. Zone 13, he said. San's eyelid twitched. We have many zones. Conrad turned away without waiting for permission and walked deeper into the warehouse. Guards shifted. Clerks whispered. San followed, still smiling, but now the smile had an edge. At the far end, Stack stood higher, pressed close to a wall where a narrow service corridor ran behind. 2 guards stood there, arms crossed. Conrad stopped. Move, he said. The guards looked to San. San sighed, as if indulging a child. Let him pass, he said. The guards moved reluctantly. Behind the stacks, the service corridor was tighter, darker, and smelled faintly of oil. Conrad followed it to a door banded with iron. A sign hung crooked, lamp black, and hearth, as non-food goods. Conrad's skin prickled. He looked at San. Open it. San's smile returned, though it was thinner now. Of course. He produced a key and unlocked the door with a flourish that tried to make it feel routine. Inside, casks sat in rows. Their lids were sealed with wax stamped with the guild mark. The labels were neat, lamp black, hearth ash, pigment residue. Conrad stepped closer. The air here was colder, despite being indoors. He reached out and ran his thumb over the wax seal. The seal was fresh. He looked at San. You move ash often? San lifted his shoulders. Trade is complex. Pigments, dyes, metalwork. Conrad's gaze held his for a long heartbeat. Then he turned away, filed it, and walked out. The daylight inspection ended with nothing that could be used in court. Nothing that could be shouted in the square without being buried under paperwork by nightfall. San accompanied them back to the office as if escorting honored guests. At the door, he paused. I want to help, he said softly, earnest as a priest. But understand me, witch hunter. If you accuse the guild publicly without proof, you will make powerful enemies. Proper channels exist for a reason. Conrad stared at him. Proper channels exist so men like you can wash blood off your hands, he said. San's smile sharpened. Be careful, he murmured, voice still polite. Sigmar's justice is admirable, but law is particular. Even witch hunters can be censured. Even witch hunters can be recalled. Conrad turned away without responding. He didn't need to trade threats. He dealt in outcomes. Outside the district, the river fog thickened as the sun sank. Lice walked beside Conrad in silence until they reached the shadow of a boarded-up chapel. You believe it's in there, she said finally, voice hoarse. Conrad nodded, once. And he'll bury you in ink, Lys said. Conrad's mouth tightened. Then we don't go through ink, he said. We go through doors. Night made thieves of honest people, and saints of desperate ones. Conrad waited until the district's lanterns burned lower, and the patrols grew lazy with routine. He and Lys moved like smudges between buildings, keeping to the blind spots behind stacks of empty crates, under the shadow of a wagon shed, along the river's edge where fog hid their breath. Holtz had wanted to come. Conrad had refused. The Templar was a torch, not a knife, and this needed a knife. Lys knew the shape of sacks and chutes the way priests knew prayers. She led Conrad along the back of the flour warehouse, pointing out the service corridor door they'd seen by day. 2 guards stood there at night as well. One leaned on a spear, the other smoked a pipe, the ember glowing like a watching eye. Conrad crouched in the fog and watched their rhythm. Smoke, shift weight, scratch nose, laugh softly, too comfortable. He slid a small pouch from his coat, powdered snuff, mixed with ground pepper and a pinch of something harsher. He tossed it into the fog near the guard's feet. The cloud rose invisibly. The guards inhaled. The first coughed, then gagged, eyes watering. The second sputtered and bent over, retching, pipe falling from his mouth into the damp. Conrad moved. He rose silently and crossed the distance in 3 long steps. He struck the first guard under the ear with the heel of his hand. The guard crumpled with a wet grunt. The second tried to shout, but Conrad drove his knife into the man's thigh and twisted. The guard's scream became a strangled wheeze as Conrad clamped a hand over his mouth and hauled him down into the fog. "Sleep," Conrad whispered, and slammed the man's head against the wall. Lys's eyes were wide. She swallowed hard and forced herself not to look at the bodies. Conrad opened the service door and slipped inside. The corridor smelled of flour and oil. They moved quickly, feet silent on planks dusted white. Conrad's heart beat steady. Every sense sharpened. They reached the ash door. The lock was simple. Conrad worked it with a thin pick and a twist of patience until it clicked open. Inside, the casks waited in rows. Lys stepped in and froze. Her breath hitched. "What?" Conrad murmured. She moved closer to one cask, crouched, and brushed away dust near the base. Her fingers found something. A small pipe fitted into the cask's side, leading into the wall. "That's not for storage," she whispered. "That's for feeding." Conrad's skin crawled. They pried a lid. The wax seal cracked with a soft snap, like a bone breaking. Conrad lifted the lid slowly. Inside was gray ash, fine as flour, piled smooth as water in a bowl. It did not smell like hearth. It smelled like cold metal and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit left too long. Conrad's fingertips tingled, as if the air itself had teeth. He dipped a knife tip into the ash and lifted it. The gray powder clung, not falling away like soot. It held to the metal, as if attracted. Lys leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "That's wrong," she whispered. Conrad's mouth went tight. "Yes," he said. He followed the pipe. It led into a hidden chute system built into the warehouse wall, thin brass nozzles positioned over where flour sacks would be opened and poured. A dosing line, invisible in daylight, buried behind stacked goods. "Someone designed this," Lys said, voice sick. "This isn't casual." Conrad's mind raced. If they could dose flour in small amounts, spread it through a mill, through bread, through a town. A plank creaked behind them. Conrad spun, pistol half raised. A lantern flared. A shout rang out, sharp as a whip. "Intruders!" The alarm bell began to clang, distant at first, then louder as it was taken up down the row of buildings. Footsteps thundered. Voices rose. Dogs barked. Conrad slammed the cask lid down and grabbed it, only the lid, wax seal, still attached. He shoved it under his coat. "Ledger," he snapped to Lies. "Find paperwork. Anything." Lies darted toward a clerk's station tucked into the ash room, an inventory desk. She tore open a drawer, fingers frantic, pulling out a bound slipbook and loose pages. Her hands landed on a manifest, stamped with a guild seal and marked with the same Zone 13 identifier. She ripped the page free. Conrad grabbed her arm. "Move." They ran. They burst into the corridor as guards poured in from the far end, lanterns swinging, shadows leaping. A spear jabbed toward Conrad. He fired. The shot punched through the guard's throat. Blood sprayed in a hot arc across the wall, dark in lantern light. The guard fell, gurgling. Conrad vaulted over him, dragging Lies. They sprinted through a side door into the main warehouse and straight up a stairwell to the catwalks that ran along the stacked sacks like ribs. Below, workers and guards surged, shouting, pointing. Conrad's boots hammered wood. Pain flared in his ribs. He ignored it. They reached the first rope bridge, spanning to the next warehouse, two thick ropes for hands, narrow planks beneath, river fog yawning below. The bridge swayed with every step. Lantern light shimmered off the dark water far beneath. "Go," Conrad snarled. Lies stepped onto the bridge and nearly slipped. Conrad shoved her forward, keeping her moving. Behind them, guards poured onto the catwalk, cudgels raised. A bolt hissed through the air and thudded into a post beside Conrad's head, vibrating. He ducked instinctively, grabbed the bridge rope, and hauled himself onto the swaying planks. Halfway across, a guard stepped onto the bridge after them. The ropes sagged under his weight. The planks bucked. Conrad turned, pistol raised. The guard lunged, trying to grab Conrad's coat. Conrad did not shoot. The pistol was too precious, too slow. He kicked. His boot slammed into the guard's knee. The joint snapped with a wet pop. The guard screamed and collapsed, arms flailing, fingers grabbing at rope. Conrad stomped on his hands. Bone cracked. The guard lost his grip. He fell into the fog, screaming until the river swallowed him. Conrad hauled Lies off the far end of the bridge and onto another catwalk, sprinting through a maze of stacked crates and hanging nets. Below, guards ran along ground lanes, trying to cut them off. Lanterns bobbed like angry fireflies. A dog leapt up at the catwalk edge, jaws snapping. Conrad fired point blank. The dog's skull burst, blood misting the air. It fell without a sound. They reached the outer edge of the district where the warehouses backed directly onto the river. A final rope bridge led to a maintenance platform, and then to the palisade's shadowed corner, where the posts were old and the ground slick with algae. Conrad cut the bridge rope behind them with one quick slice. The bridge swung away, collapsing into the fog with a groan of wood and rope. They dropped down to the riverbank and ran along the muddy edge, slipping, panting, the river's breath cold on their faces. Behind them, shouts faded, swallowed by mist and distance. They didn't stop until the guild lanterns were far behind and the town's poorer streets closed in again, crooked alleys, leaning buildings, the familiar stink of desperation. In the shelter of an abandoned shed, Conrad finally let himself breathe. Each inhalation tugged at his ribs like a hook. Lies sagged against a wall, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Conrad pulled the cask lid from under his coat. The wax seal was intact, gild mark crisp. Grey dust clung faintly to the underside, glittering almost imperceptibly as if metal lived in it. He pulled out the ledger page lice had stolen. The ink was clear, the stamp undeniable. Proof, or as close as a man could get before money started eating it. Morning came with a knock, not on Conrad's door, on the town itself, a heavy fist of authority. By the time Conrad reached the magistrate's office, the building's front steps were lined with guild men. Their faces were calm, their cudgels were clean. Their presence was a statement. We are here, and you will behave. Magistrate Irvin Mauer met Conrad in his office with sweat on his brow and fear in his eyes. He did not offer a seat. He did not look at Conrad's bandages. Witch hunter, Mauer said quickly, voice thin. There's been a complaint. Conrad set the cask lid on the magistrate's desk. The wax seal caught the light. Mauer's eyes flicked to it, then away as if it burned. You cannot bring guild property in here. Conrad placed a ledger page beside it. This is evidence, he said. You sign an order. We seize the ash casks. We arrest Roderick San. Mauer swallowed hard. I'm unable to assist, he whispered. Conrad stared. Unable. Mauer's hands trembled. Proper channels, he said, almost pleading. The guild charter. Conrad's voice dropped. Where is my evidence file? Mauer blinked. Conrad's eyes narrowed. He stepped around the desk, yanked open the magistrate's evidence drawer, and found it empty. No cask lit. No ledger page. Nothing. He turned slowly. Mauer stood rigid, face pale as paper. They came this morning, Mauer whispered. They had documents, orders. They said you were acting outside jurisdiction. They said, Sigmar, forgive me, they said. They would call for your recall. Conrad's jaw clenched until it ached. Outside, through the window, guild men stood in the sunlight like statues, their smiles polite and hard as iron. Conrad looked at the empty drawer, then at Mauer, then at the bright guild banners hanging clean over filthy streets. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough to be dangerous. Then I'll make a new file, he said, and he left the magistrate's office with nothing in his hands but the weight of the town on his back and the knowledge that the guild's proper channels were not paths to justice. They were gutters, designed to carry blood away unseen. Chapter 4. Bread Riots and Parchment Wars. Grissenhafen did not break all at once. It cracked along its old seams, hunger, fear, debt. Shame then split wide enough for something ugly to crawl through. By the third day after the market bloodshed, the town had learned a new rhythm. Shutters slammed at dusk. Boots ran in the night. Prayer bells rang not for saints, but for warnings. Smoke from the burned stalls still clung to the stones, and every time the wind shifted it carried that char and rancid fat smell back through the alleys like a reminder. This is what you are now. Bread should have calmed them. Bread was the cheapest mercy. A warm loaf was supposed to mean tomorrow existed. Instead, the smell of baking turned stomachs. People stood in line outside bakeries with knives tucked into sleeves. Mothers watched their children's hands and mouths like hawks. Men chewed slowly, suspiciously, eyes darting as if someone might steal the bite from between their teeth. And then the fever took them, sometimes minutes after the first crust, sometimes an hour later, and the town would flare. It always started the same. A cough, a twitch, a laugh that didn't fit the face wearing it. Then violence, quick as struck flint. In the southern ward, a cooper's wife threw boiling water on her neighbor because the neighbor's cat looked at her wrong. On the docks, two stevedores tore each other's throats open over a sack of grain that turned out to be empty. In the temple quarter, a street preacher declared Sigmar had sent wrath for hidden sin, and the crowd answered by dragging a tanner out of his shop and beating him until his skull cracked like a dropped jug. The sick became violent. The violent became righteous. And righteous men did not feel guilty. They built pyres from broken furniture and stole lamp oil, and at night the fires dotted the town like a second constellation, small red eyes staring up through the smoke. Sometimes the pyres were empty, just a threat and a prayer. Sometimes they weren't. Conrad Vel walked through it all like a man wading upstream through sewage. Boots heavy with mud, coat smelling of smoke. Every corner held a new knife. Every doorway held someone deciding whether to spit or beg. He had never needed affection. He had never expected gratitude. But he had counted on one thing: fear of the badge. Fear of the authority his sigil represented. Now people stared at that sigil and saw not protection, but a spark that might ignite them. The Merchant Guild fed that fire carefully. They didn't do it with cudgels at first. They did it with words. A proclamation appeared on walls overnight, pasted so thickly you could smell the glue. Clean parchment, crisp ink, gilded seal, by order of the Merchant Guild of Christenhafen. The recent disturbances are attributable to unsanitary and unlicensed milling practices, resulting in grain rot and fever. For the safety of all, the Capel Mill is hereby placed under temporary guild custody pending review. Any who spread false rumors against lawful trade shall be subject to penalty under charter. The words were careful. No mention of ash, no mention of the warehouse, no mention of dead children or bitten ears. Just unsanitary, unlicensed review. The guild's iron smile. People read it and nodded because it gave them someone with a name to hate. A woman. A mill. A scapegoat that could bleed. By midday, guild factors and hired cudgel men marched to Capel's Mill with magistrate seals in hand. They came under banners, bright cloth, clean stitching so it looked official, inevitable, righteous. Lise watched from across the yard, tucked into the shadow of a collapsed shed, as her mill was taken from her. The men moved with practiced efficiency. They hammered new locks into place. They posted guards with armbands. They rolled out barrels of lime and scattered it in white lines across thresholds, as if drawing holy wards. They produced papers thick as a priest's Bible and read them aloud while the townsfolk gathered. A guild factor with polished boots raised his voice. "This is for the good of Christenhafen," he declared. "No one is accused, no one is condemned. But until proper inspection, a stone struck his shoulder, thrown from the crowd. He flinched, and his mask of calm slipped just enough to show irritation. Then the crowd surged, not at the factor, not at the guild men with cudgels, but at the mill workers. Those men and women were easy prey, flour-dusted hands, tired backs, no swords. They'd been seen carrying sacks out of the mill that week. That was enough to make them guilty. A woman named Marta, who'd worked the stones since she was 14, went down with a scream as someone smashed a bottle across her face. Blood ran down her chin in a glittering line. A boy who'd swept the floor was yanked by his hair and beaten with a plank until he curled in on himself like a kicked dog. Rotters, the mob howled. Poisoners, one man, eyes fever-bright, mouth flecked with crumbs, held a torch aloft and tried to shove it into the mill door. A guild guard stepped in front, cudgel raised. "Not the building," he snapped. "Not yet. Not yet." The words were calm, procedural. The mob obeyed, because the guild had given them permission to be angry, just not so angry that it harmed property. Conrad arrived too late to stop the first bones breaking. He forced his way through the crowd, shoulder-checking men who stank of sweat and cheap ale, shoving aside women with stones in their fists. He drew his pistol once, firing into the air. The shot cracked like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Conrad stepped onto a barrel and looked down at them. Smoke curled around his hat brim, painting his face in shadow. His voice came out cold as river ice. "Back away from the workers," he said. "Now," a man spat. "They poisoned us." "You don't know that," Conrad snapped. "You know what the guild tells you." The word guild rippled through the crowd like a thrown hook. Heads turned, faces twisted. A woman screamed, "Witch hunter's in on it!" Another shouted, "He's protecting the rotters!" A rock flew. It hit Conrad's shoulder and bounced off. Another struck the barrel beside him, splintering wood. Conrad's fingers tightened around his pistol until the metal creaked. He could kill them. He could turn the square into a butcher's yard, and the mob would scatter. But then the guild would win. They would paint him as a madman, as a tyrant, as a heretic hunter drunk on power. They would bury his authority under charters and writs and outraged sermons. So he holstered the pistol, climbed down, and waded into the bodies. He grabbed the nearest man by the collar and slammed him against the mill wall. "Back," he hissed into the man's face, "or I break you." The man's breath stank of stale bread. His pupils were too wide. He smiled a terrible, eager thing and tried to bite Conrad's cheek. Conrad headbutted him. Hard. The man's nose broke with a crunch. Blood sprayed. The man sagged, laughing wetly through his own pain. Conrad shoved him away and turned to the next attacker. His knuckles found jaw, throat, temple. He fought not like a duelist, but like a man keeping wolves off a wounded animal. A punch, a kick, a shove into mud. He moved through the crowd with brutal economy, clearing a ring of space around the beaten workers. Behind him, Lise stared. She'd never seen a witch hunter fight up close. She'd imagined pistols and dramatic pronouncements. What she saw instead was a man who fought like a butcher, efficient, ugly, and merciless in exactly the places that mattered. The guildmen watched with polite distance. They did not help. They let Conrad bleed and sweat and take the mob's hatred onto his own shoulders, because it served their story. When the crowd finally retreated more from exhaustion than fear, the guild factor stepped forward again, smoothing his coat as if nothing had happened. "Witch hunter Vel," he called, voice bright. You are interfering with lawful guild process. Conrad turned, chest heaving. Lawful, he spat. The factor held up a rolled parchment. By charter, by seal of Magistrate Mauer, by... Conrad's mouth tightened. Mauer is a coward in a borrowed chair. The factor's smile hardened. He unrolled the parchment with ceremonial slowness. You are hereby served, he said. The words hit like a blade. Writ of complaint, harassment of lawful trade, writ of injunction, trespass upon guild property, notice of investigation, seditious conduct, and threats against charter. The crowd murmured. Some laughed nervously. Some looked relieved. Paper was a weapon they understood. It meant someone else was in charge. Someone else would decide who got punished. Conrad stared at the writs, jaw grinding. You can't do this, Lies whispered. Oh, they can, Conrad murmured back. Because the law is a rope, and the guild holds both ends. Brother Sergeant Holtz arrived then, pushing through the thinning crowd. His eyes were wild with excitement, as if the chaos fed him. He took in the battered workers, the guild seals, the writs. His lips parted in something close to joy. You see, he hissed at Conrad. Now the rot shows itself plainly. The miller is to blame, and the guild will shield her for coin unless we force the truth. Conrad's gaze flicked to him. The guild is blaming her, he said flatly. Holtz's nostrils flared. Of course they are. They will sacrifice her to protect their own, so we take her first. We burn her. We make the crowd see Sigmar's justice, and the fever will. Conrad grabbed Holtz by the breastplate and yanked him close until their faces were a handspan apart. You don't burn people to calm crowds, Conrad snarled. You burn people because you like the smell of certainty. Holtz's eyes flashed. You protect her because you fear acting. Conrad's voice dropped. I fear wasting the only life that can lead me to proof. Holtz's hand drifted toward his sword hilt. The street around them felt suddenly too quiet, as if the town itself held its breath. A few bystanders slowed to watch, scenting violence the way dogs scent blood. Conrad released Holtz, stepped back, and placed his hand on his pistol. Not drawing, not yet. A warning. Holzdrev. Steel slid from scabbard with a clean whisper. The blade caught the daylight and turned it into a bright line. You question my faith, Holtz said, voice trembling with fury. You stand between Sigmar and justice. Conrad's fingers curled around his pistol grip. Your faith is not on trial, he said. Your restraint is. Holtz took a step forward. If you won't cleanse this town, witch hunter, I will. Lisa's breath hitched. Her hands clenched around the edge of her hood. Conrad could see the outcome if he fired. Holtz dead. The Templars enraged. The guild triumphant. He could see the outcome if he didn't. Holtz leading a mob to a pyre with Lise tied to it. So Conrad did something uglier than either. He stepped in before Holtz could swing. Conrad drove his fist into Holtz's throat hard enough to crush breath. Holtz gagged, eyes bulging, blade wavering. Conrad twisted the sword arm, snapped the Templar's wrist with a crack, and wrenched the blade free. He threw it into the mud and leaned close, whispering so only Holtz could hear. You draw on me again, Conrad said, and I'll put you in the ground and write accident in your prayer book. Holtz sank to his knees, clutching his throat, eyes burning with hatred and humiliation. Conrad turned away from him, as if he were already irrelevant. That night, Grissenhafen burnt, not in one great blaze, but in 100 small ones. A baker's shop went up in the western ward, after someone swore the owner was cutting flour with demon dust. A tallow chandler was dragged from his bed and beaten because his candles had been used to light a riot. A watchman was lynched for being too slow to stop a beating, and his body hung from a lamppost with a crust of bread stuffed into his mouth like a gag. Conrad moved through it like a shadow, with a lantern that only he could see. He listened at doors. He watched wagons. He counted patrols. He followed the thread that mattered, ignoring the screaming distractions. The guild wanted the town to riot. The guild wanted everyone looking at the mill, the bad practices, the convenient woman with a bruise on her jaw, because while the town fought itself, trade moved quietly. In the narrow hours before dawn, Conrad crouched on a rooftop above the warehouse district and watched the river road. Guild wagons rolled out in a steady line, 3 at first, then 6, then more. Their wheels were muffled with cloth. Their horses' hooves were wrapped. Lanterns were hooded. Men with crossbows rode alongside, heads down, faces hidden, and over each wagon, bright even in the dim, a guild banner fluttered. Conrad's mouth went dry. "Cover," he whispered. "They're moving it." Beside him, Lise sat hunched, wrapped in a borrowed cloak. Her face looked hollow in the moonlight. She'd been hiding in Conrad's rented room since the mill seizure, sleeping in snatches, waking at every shout. She followed his gaze to the convoy and flinched. "They're taking my flour," she whispered. "No," Conrad said. "They're taking the ash." Lizzie shook her head, confused. Then something in her face changed, shame tightening her mouth. "There's something," she said quietly. Conrad looked at her. She swallowed hard. "A year ago," she whispered, "the guild offered improvements. They said my chute system was old, that the flow could be made smoother, less waste, better profit. Her voice broke. "I took it." Conrad's eyes narrowed. "What did you take?" Liza's hands clenched in her lap. "A brass fitting," she said. "A little piece they bolted into the flower chute. They called it a flow regulator. It looked harmless, just brass. I didn't think." Conrad's jaw clenched. He saw it instantly. The nozzle, the dosing line, the hidden system in the warehouse. "They built it into your mill?" he said, voice like stone. Liz nodded, tears glinting but not falling. "I thought it was just trade, just efficiency." Her voice turned bitter. "I wanted to keep the mill, keep my workers fed. Sigmar, forgive me. I signed the paper and didn't read the fine words." Conrad stared at the convoy again, watching the wagons vanish into the mist like a snake sliding into grass. Engineered chaos, not spontaneous madness. A plan that used hunger and fear like tools. A plan that turned a town into a weapon and then quietly shipped the blade elsewhere. Conrad's mind mapped the next hours. If he chased the convoy, he might stop the ash from reaching a larger city. He might catch someone with casks and seals and proof still warm in their hands. But if he left Grissenhafen, Holtz would light fires in his absence. The mob would tear Lice apart. The guild would tighten its grip, erase evidence, rewrite the story until Conrad's name became a curse. If he stayed, the ash would vanish upriver, and Grissenhafen would become merely the first page in a larger slaughter. The town behind him crackled with distant fires. Somewhere a bell rang, frantic. Somewhere someone screamed and then stopped. The convoy's last banner flickered in the mist and disappeared. Conrad's hand curled on the roof edge until splinters bit his palm. Choice was a luxury. He had none. He rose slowly, coat settling around him like a shroud, eyes fixed on the road where the wagons had gone. Below, the river breathed, thick and patient, carrying trade and death on the same current. And in the grey hour before dawn, Conrad Vel stood between two kinds of ruin, one screaming in the streets behind him, one rolling away under guild banners ahead, and knew that whatever he chose, people would burn. Chapter 5. The Convoy of Grey Dust. Conrad chose the road because the river belonged to the guild. He left Grissenhafen while the last fire still licked at the night's edges, while the town's screams were muffled behind shuttered windows and locked doors. He left without ceremony, without a farewell, without the foolish comfort of believing he could save everyone if he simply moved fast enough. He left because the convoy had wheels, and wheels could be stopped. Lise Capel came with him because there was nowhere else to go. Her mill was caged behind guild locks. Her name had become a curse, scratched on tavern walls. If she stayed, she'd be handed to Hultz's appetite for purges or torn apart by people who needed a face to spit at. 2 others followed, not allies by oath, but by the crude arithmetic of survival. The first was a one-eyed road warden named Fenn, a man who smelled of wet leather and old grudges. He wore a battered breastplate under his cloak and carried a crossbow that looked like it had killed more men than deer. He'd lost his post to guild bribes and drank his rage in cheap ale, until Conrad offered him something better, a target. The second was a wiry dock thief called Sella, small as a ferret, with a knife in each boot and a mind that counted coins even when she slept. She'd once run with the Ashmen before they turned strange, before they stopped being simple thugs and started moving like soldiers. She didn't follow Conrad out of loyalty. She followed because she'd seen grey ash on tongues and didn't like what it did to the eyes. Brother Sergeant Hultz was not with them. Conrad had left him behind in the town's smoke and hatred, nursing bruises and the humiliation of having his zeal beaten down in the street. If Hultz hunted them, he would do it in the proper way, with sermons and warrants and a mob. Conrad preferred knives in the dark. They rode hard on the road that ran parallel to the river, where the land rose into low hills and crooked copses of dead trees. Rain fell in thin, relentless sheets that turned the world into a smear. Mud sucked at hooves. Wheels groaned on rutted tracks. The sky was a lid of pewter pressed down on everything living. War had touched this road before. It always did in the Empire. No road escaped being marched on by hungry armies, tax collectors, plague carts, or worse. Along the ditch line, old corpses hung from trees in iron cages, ribs picked clean, skulls grinning at the rain. Some were criminals, some were rebels. Some were just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place when a lord needed an example. The cages creaked as the wind tugged them, metal whining like a distant lament. Sella spat as they passed one. "That one's recent," she muttered. "Guild's been busy," Fenn grunted. "Everyone's busy. Only difference is who gets paid for it." Conrad rode ahead, hat brim low, rain slicking down his coat. The hook scratch in his ribs flared with each jolt of the saddle, a steady reminder that flesh was weak and time was shorter than pride wanted to admit. He tracked the convoy the way he tracked men, by the marks they left when they thought no one watched. The road bore the imprint of many wheels, but the guild wagons were heavier, their ruts deeper. A patch of churned mud where horses had been forced to stand and piss, fresh-cut branches tossed into the ditch to hide a turn, a broken strap discarded hastily. By midday, they found the first sure sign. A guild banner, scrap bright cloth, torn and smeared with mud, caught on a thorn bush, fluttering like a wounded bird. Conrad lifted it, fingers tightening. The guild's mark stared back. A stylized scale and sheaf of wheat. Clean ink, clean lines, a lie made pretty. "They're close," he said. The rain intensified, turning the road into a brown river. Fog rose off the ground, clinging to boot tops and horse bellies. The world narrowed to a few yards of visibility and the constant sound of water. It was in that murk that they first saw the Ashmen escort. Not all at once, not a neat line like a proper patrol. They moved like shadows between trees, keeping pace with the road, appearing and vanishing behind trunks and hanging moss. Their cloaks were dark, their faces were hidden, but their posture was wrong, too controlled, too disciplined for dock scum who'd once fought over spilled ale. Sella's hand went to the knife in her boot. "That's them," she whispered. "And that ain't how they used to move." Fen squinted through the rain. "They're not talking." "No," Sella said, voice tight. "They don't, now. Not much." Conrad watched one of them step out from behind a tree, glance toward the road, then melt back into the brush. The movement was economical, purposeful, like a man who'd been trained, or like a man who wasn't fully in his own skull. They followed the escort at a distance until the road dipped into a shallow ravine where broken stones jutted from the earth like teeth. Here the trees grew closer together, branches tangled overhead, the light dim. The rain became a constant drip, 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 like a slow clock counting down. Ahead, through the fog, something pale rose from the roadside, a ruined shrine. It had once been a waystone chapel, a humble thing built by peasants and travelers, 4 stone pillars, a cracked roof, and at its center an old statue of Sigmar with hammer raised. Time and weather had chewed it. The statue's face was gone, worn smooth. The hammer had snapped, leaving only a jagged stump. Someone had daubed crude symbols on the stone in pitch-black paint, slashing marks, circles, words half scrubbed away as if even the vandal had regretted writing them. The shrine sat at a bend where the road narrowed, hemmed in by ravine walls and trees, a perfect choke point. Conrad's eyes narrowed. "We stop them here," he said. Fen snorted. 4 against a convoy? Conrad looked at him. "You want to chase them forever?" Fen's one eye held Conrad's stare. Then he spat into the mud. "Fair." They set the ambush with the grim efficiency of men and women who'd done worse for less. Fen and Conrad hauled a deadfall log half-rotten, heavy as sin, into position above the bend, propping it against the ravine edge so it could be pushed down across the road at the right moment. Sella worked lower, loosening stones along the roadside and rigging a crude tripline with rope and iron hooks scavenged from an old fence. Lee's, hands shaking but determined, helped drag rubble into the ravine's shadow to create cover. She wasn't a fighter by trade, but fear sharpened her into something useful. Conrad checked his pistol powder, dry beneath oiled leather, then drew his blade and wiped it clean of old stains that would not come out no matter how hard he scrubbed. He did not pray. His faith was action. The rain muffled sound. The fog hid them. The corpse cages creaked far above like dead bells. When the convoy came, it came quietly. The first sound was wheels, a wet grind in the mud, steady, heavy, then the faint clink of harness chains, then the low breath of horses. Shapes emerged from the fog lanterns, hooded, wagons, dark, banners rolled tight to avoid drawing eyes. Crossbowmen walked alongside, with weapons cradled, heads down. There were 6 wagons, not the dozen Conrad had seen leaving town, but enough. Enough to ruin a city if each carried even a handful of ash. Guild men rode with them, clerks with ink-stained fingers and soft hands, trying to look hard in leather coats. Guards with armbands, cudgels replaced by swords for the road, and the ashmen. They moved at the convoy's edges like hunting dogs, silent, watchful. Their discipline was unnerving. One would pause, scan the tree line, then continue. Another would drift ahead, then fall back, as if guided by an invisible hand. Conrad felt his skin prickle. "Now," he mouthed. Fen shoved the deadfall. The log rolled, scraped, then dropped into the road with a wet crash that shook mud and stones. It landed across the path, blocking it completely. Horses screamed and reared, hooves flailing. One wagon's front wheel slammed into the log and splintered with a sharp crack. At the same moment, Sella yanked her trip line. Iron hooks snapped taut across the road at shin height. A guard running forward to clear the log hit it and went down hard, legs scissored out from under him. His head struck stone with a dull thud. He didn't get up. Conrad stood from the ravine shadow and fired. The pistol shot cracked through the rain like thunder. The nearest crossbowman jerked as the ball punched through his throat. Blood fountained, bright against grey, and he collapsed into the mud, gurgling. Chaos erupted. Guards shouted orders. Horses screamed. Crossbows snapped up. Bolts hissed into fog and thudded into wood and stone. Fen fired his crossbow from above, bolt punching into a guild guard's chest. The man staggered, eyes wide, then fell backward into the road, trampled by panicking horses. Sella darted along the ravine edge like a knife in the dark, slipping between wagons. She cut harness straps with quick slashes, sending one horse free. The animal bolted, dragging a wagon sideways, wheels sinking deeper into mud. Lizzie crouched behind a stone slab from the ruined shrine, clutching a heavy mill hammer she'd taken from her own tool chest, iron head, short handle, built for crushing grain. Her knuckles were white. Her breath came in sharp bursts. A guild captain, a man with a plumed cap now soaked into a sad rag, shouted, "Form up! Form!" Conrad shot him in the mouth. The captain's head snapped back, plume whipping. He fell in a heap, blood bubbling between his lips. The ashmen reacted faster than the guild guards. They flowed toward the ambush points, not charging blindly, but moving in pairs, covering each other. 2 darted up the ravine path toward Fen. Another pair cut toward the shrine, knives drawn, aiming for Lys. Conrad stepped into their path. An ashman lunged, blade flashing. Conrad parried, steel ringing. The ashman's strength was wrong too strong for his wiry frame. He pushed with a savage force that made Conrad's arm jar to the bone. Conrad drove his elbow into the ashman's face. Teeth cracked. The man didn't even flinch, only laughed wetly, eyes glassy, and kept coming. Driven, Sella had said. Conrad cut across the ashman's forearm, slicing deep. Blood spilled dark and hot. The ashman watched it with fascination, then licked it from his own skin, tongue gray at the edges. Conrad's stomach tightened. Another ashman came from behind. Hook aimed for Conrad's ribs, same crude butcher tool as in the alley, the same methodical violence. Conrad twisted aside, felt the hook bite coat and flesh, and roared as pain flared. He grabbed the hook shaft and yanked, dragging the ashman forward into his blade. Steel slid into gut. The ashman's breath hissed out, and then, impossibly, he grinned, leaning closer as if to whisper. "Warm loaves," the ashman rasped, voice thick. "Cold knives." Conrad shoved him away. The man collapsed into the mud, still smiling as he bled. The shrine became a slaughterhouse. Crossbow bolts thudded into stone. One struck Sigmar's faceless statue in the chest, splintering old rock. Another buried itself in a wagon plank, vibrating. Fenn's position above was compromised. 2 ashmen had climbed the ravine slope with animal agility, ignoring loose stones and slick mud. Fenn drew a short sword and met the first with a savage chop that took off fingers. The ashman didn't scream. He only hissed and threw himself forward, trying to bite Fenn's throat. Fenn rammed the blade into the man's mouth and twisted. Teeth shattered. Blood poured. The ashman fell, twitching. The second ashman slammed into Fenn's side, knocking him off balance. They rolled in the mud near the ravine edge, grappling like dogs. Fenn's one eye bulged with effort. The ashman's tongue flashed gray-black as he snapped and laughed. Below, a guild clerk, soft-faced, cheeks trembling, tried to run. Sella caught him by the collar and slammed him against a wagon. "Stay," she hissed. The clerk sobbed. I'm not." A guard raised a sword and charged Sella. Lisa rose from behind the shrine slab and swung her mill hammer with both hands. The hammer hit the guard's knee. Bone burst. The guard screamed, collapsing, sword flying. Lise stepped forward, face twisted in fury and fear, and brought the hammer down again onto the guard's head. The sound was awful, wet, final. Lise staggered back, staring at what she'd done. Breath coming in ragged sobs she swallowed down. Blood spattered her sleeves like red flour. Conrad saw her and felt something cold settle deeper in his chest. The town was turning everyone into a killer. That was the point. He turned toward the wagons. They needed proof. They needed to see what the casks carried. They needed to stop the ash from moving again. Conrad climbed onto the nearest wagon, boots slipping on wet wood. A cask sat beneath tarpaulin, sealed with guild wax. He ripped the tarp away, exposing the neat label. "Lamp-black, non-food, lice and ink." He drove his blade under the lid seam and pried. Wax cracked. The lid popped. Grey ash lay inside, smooth as poured water. Conrad's skin prickled instantly, as if invisible insects crawled across him. The air around the cask felt colder, sharper, like a blade held near the eye. A guard below shouted, "Don't!" Conrad kicked the cask. It tipped. Ash, spille. The grey dust rose in a soft cloud, swirling in the rain like smoke that refused to die. For a heartbeat it looked harmless, just powder, just residue. Then it touched mouths. One ashman, mid-fight with Fenn, inhaled sharply. His eyes widened, pupils dilating until they swallowed the whites. He released Fenn and turned, snarling not at Conrad, not at the enemy, but at the nearest living thing. He leapt at another ashman and sank his teeth into the man's cheek, ripping flesh. The bitten ashman screamed in shock and fury, then struck back, knife plunging into ribs. They fell together, tearing and stabbing like rabid animals. A guild guard coughed as ash drifted into his face. He staggered, eyes watering, then suddenly laughed high and bright before swinging his sword wildly at his own companion. Steel bit shoulder. The companion screamed. The guard kept hacking, expression ecstatic. The battlefield dissolved into madness. The ash didn't choose sides. It didn't care about guild marks or loyalties. It was hunger and fever and rage made tangible, and it spread through breath. Conrad dropped from the wagon as the cloud thickened, pulling his scarf up over his mouth. His eyes burned. His tongue tasted metal. He saw Sella's face twist as she inhaled a trace. Her gaze sharpened, teeth clenching. For a moment she looked like she might stab the sobbing clerk just to see blood spill. Conrad grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her hard. "Breathe through cloth," he snarled. "Don't swallow it." Sella blinked rapidly, fighting something inside her skull. "It," she rasped. "It wants—" "I know," Conrad snapped. He shoved her behind the shrine slab, away from the drifting cloud. The rain helped, pushing ash down into mud, but not fast enough. Fighters stumbled, coughing, then lunged at whoever was closest. Men who had been trained to stand in formation now clawed at each other's eyes. Ashmen who had moved like soldiers now devolved into frothing beasts. It was like watching a town riot compressed into minutes. Conrad moved through it with brutal purpose, avoiding the worst of the cloud, using the chaos as cover. He grabbed the captured clerk still pinned by Sella and hauled him behind the shrine. The clerk's eyes were wide, pupils trembling. "Don't kill me," he sobbed. "Please, please. I just write numbers." Conrad slammed him against the stone pillar hard enough to knock breath out of him. "Where was this convoy going?" Conrad hissed. The clerk shook his head frantically. "I don't know. I swear." Conrad's knife appeared, its tip pressing under the clerk's chin, just enough to bite skin. "You know," Conrad said softly, "or you die here in the mud with the rest." The clerk's eyes darted toward the battle, where a man was tearing another's throat out with his teeth. The clerk gagged. "Barge," he choked. "River barge bound upriver. Bigger city," they said. He swallowed, tears mixing with rain. They said it would open the market. They said riots would make demand. They said Sigmar help me. They said the ash would seed the region. Conrad's grip tightened. "Where?" the clerk sobbed. "Old Dock North Bend. There's a mooring. Only guild uses. Dock." A scream cut him off. Fenn staggered into view, blood streaming down his side, one eye wild. Behind him, an ashman face shredded, laughing through missing teeth charged with a knife. Conrad stepped out and shot the ashman through the forehead. The man's laugh cut off mid-note. He dropped like a sack. Fenn spat blood into the mud. "This ain't a convoy," he rasped. "It's a plague cart." Conrad looked out at the ruin. Half the wagons were wrecked. Horses lay screaming or dead. Men rolled in mud, stabbing and biting. The ash cloud thinned under rain, but its work was done, bodies piled, loyalties shredded. And through the chaos, Conrad saw something else. A pattern. The guild guards hadn't tried to protect the casks. They hadn't died for them. They'd fought, yes, but with a strange looseness, as if the cargo was less important than the conflict itself, as if the convoy was meant to be attacked, as if it was bait. Conrad's mind snapped back to Grissenhafen. Guild banners, public blame, writs, proper channels, Hult's zeal boiling over, a town turned against its own, witch hunter, a guild making sure every accusation became a political knife fight. Someone wanted witch hunters and guilds at each other's throats. Someone wanted the law to snarl at itself, while something else moved unseen. Conrad's gaze drifted to the ruined shrine, to the faceless statue of Sigmar, hammer broken. The black symbols daubed on stone looked less like random vandalism now and more like a message left for those who knew how to read it. Not a full mark, not a clean sign, just a hint, a smear, a margin note, a monster in the margins, grinning while men killed each other over bread. Conrad hauled the clerk closer, voice slow and lethal. "Who told you to run these casks?" he asked. The clerk shook violently. "A factor. San's office orders came down sealed." "From who above San?" Conrad pressed. The clerk's eyes squeezed shut. "I don't know. I swear I don't." Conrad believed him. That was the worst part. The guild kept its hands clean by making sure the lower fingers never saw the whole body. He released the clerk with a shove. "Tie him," he snapped to Sella. "If he runs, shoot him. If he breathes ash again and turns, cut his throat." "I am." Sella's jaw was tight, eyes still a little too bright. "Gladly," she muttered, and bound the clerk with rope so rough it burned skin. Conrad looked down the road, toward the north bend, toward the hidden mooring, toward the river barge that would carry grey dust into a larger city where riots could become rebellion, where rebellion could become war. Behind him, the ambush site continued to chew men into meat. The rain washed blood into the ditch. The corpse cages creaked overhead, counting nothing. Conrad pulled his scarf tighter, tasting metal on his tongue, and felt the cold certainty settle in his bones. This wasn't just flour cut for profit. This wasn't just guild greed. This was orchestration. A lever pulled somewhere out of sight, turning towns into knives and knives into excuses. He mounted his horse again, pain flaring through his ribs like fire, and looked once at Lice, her hands stained, her face hardening into something grim. "We go to the river," Conrad said, and as they rode into the fog, the ruined shrine vanished behind them like a bad dream, leaving only the faint, lingering taste of grey dust in the air, and the suspicion that something far worse than ash was moving under the surface, laughing while the world burned. Chapter 6. Proof in Firelight. Night on the rake's lesser veins was never truly dark. The river carried light the way it carried everything else. Reflections stretched thin across Blackwater, lanterns wobbling on mooring posts, the occasional pale flicker from a distant shrine where some sleepless fool prayed for a dawn that would not care. Mist lay low, fat as wool, and the rain had finally slackened into a cold drizzle that made every surface slick and eager to betray a boot. At the north bend, where the bank dipped into reeds and broken stone, the guild kept a private mooring. No tavern nearby, no fish stalls, no idle carters, just a lean-to shed, a watch lantern, and a narrow wooden pier that creaked with old damp A barge sat there like a sleeping beast. Its hull was tar-black and high-sided, built to carry heavy cargo without asking questions. Canvas was stretched over its central hold, tied down tight. A single guild banner hung rolled and secured, as if even its owners didn't want to draw the wrong eyes tonight. Conrad Vel watched it from the reeds, his coat soaked at the cuffs, his breath slow and measured beneath his scarf. Pain tugged in his ribs with each inhale, a hot line beneath bandage and leather. He ignored it the way he ignored hunger and fatigue. Acknowledge, then use. Lise crouched beside him, hair tucked under a hood, mill hammer slung across her back like a crude holy symbol. Her hands were still faintly stained with blood that wouldn't wash out, not from the skin and not from the mind. She stared at the barge, as if it had personally ruined her life. Fen and Sella waited behind them in the wet grass. Fen's side was wrapped in torn cloth, dark with seeped blood. His one eye never stopped moving. Sella's jaw was clenched so hard her cheek muscle twitched, and she kept rubbing her fingers together as if the memory of grey dust still clung there. The captured guild clerk rode, tied, and gagged in a cart they'd abandoned half a mile back, hidden under brush. He was alive, for now. Conrad didn't need him on the pier where panic could become a knife. Conrad lifted 2 fingers, silent signal. They moved. The pier was narrow and slick, boards wet with algae. The water beneath was black, and in it the lantern glow looked like pale fat floating on broth. Every step was a risk. One slip and the river would swallow you, heavy clothes dragging you down while the barge's hull scraped you like teeth. A single guard stood at the pier's end, cloak pulled tight, spear held more for warmth than vigilance. His lantern sat on a post beside him, hooded, throwing a wedge of yellow light into fog. His eyes were half-lidded with boredom. Sella slid ahead, like a shadow with a pulse. She came up behind the guard, one hand clamping over his mouth. Her other hand drove a knife under his ribs, quick and precise. The guard's body stiffened. His eyes bulged. He tried to scream into her palm, but the sound became a wet gurgle. Sella held him upright as he died, almost tender, then lowered him to the boards without letting him thump. She wiped her blade on his cloak, expression empty, and nodded once. They reached the barge. A rope ladder hung from the side. Conrad gripped it, tested its weight, then climbed. The ladder creaked softly. Water slapped the hull, patient. Above, the barge's deck was a narrow corridor of wet wood bordered by low rails. 2 lanterns burned under hoods, their light reduced to a dim, smoky glow. A figure moved near the central hatch, another guard, heavier, leaning on a cudgel and staring out into fog. He would have seen them if he'd been looking for threats, instead of thinking about ale and sleep. Conrad drew his pistol, raised it, then paused. A shot would be loud. Loud would mean more guards, more chaos, more ash spilled in panic. He holstered the pistol and stepped forward instead, blade in hand. The guard turned at the faint scrape of boot. His mouth opened. Conrad crossed the distance in 2 steps and drove the blade into the man's throat. The guard's eyes went wide, surprise turning instantly to horror. He tried to cough, but all that came out was a bubbling wheeze and a spray of blood that glittered in lantern light like spilled wine. Conrad eased him down and whispered, almost kindly, "Quiet." The barge remained still. The river remained indifferent. They slipped toward the hatch. Canvas ties were knotted tight, too tight, the kind of knot tied by someone who feared what was inside. Conrad cut them with a quick sawing motion and peeled back the canvas flap. The smell hit him immediately. Tar, damp wood, and beneath it that faint, sweet metal stench that lived in the ash. He lowered himself into the hold. Inside, the air was warmer and closer, thick with cargo breath. Lantern light swung from a hook, painting everything in amber and shadow. Casks sat stacked in rows, each sealed with wax stamped with the guild's mark and labeled with neat lies. Lump black, hearth ash, pigment residue. A narrow plank walkway ran between stacks. Beneath it, black water sloshed softly. The hold was low enough that river seeped into its belly like slow rot. 2 men sat at a makeshift table near the far end, one a guard with a crossbow across his knees, the other a clerk hunched over papers, quill scratching. Between them sat a bottle of something dark. They looked up as Conrad's boots touched the walkway. The guard's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Conrad fired. The pistol's crack was muffled by canvas and wood, but it still punched the air like a hammer. The ball hit the guard in the forehead. His skull snapped back. He fell without sound, crossbow clattering into the slosh. The clerk shrieked, scrambling back, knocking papers into the water. Ven dropped into the hold behind Conrad and loosed a crossbow bolt into a shadow that moved near the casks. A man cried out and collapsed, bolt buried in his chest. Then the hold erupted. More guards surged from a side compartment, 4 of them, blades drawn, faces hard. One shouted an alarm. Another lunged at Conrad with a short sword, eyes bright in lantern light. Conrad parried, steel ringing. The tight space turned every movement into a brutal, intimate act. There was no room for graceful fencing. It was elbows, knees, knife points, the wet slip of boots on planks. The guard thrust again. Conrad stepped inside the thrust and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming him into a cask. The cask rocked, wood groaning. Conrad brought his blade up under the man's arm and into his heart. The guard spasmed, mouth opening in a silent "Oh," then sagged. Sela leapt from the hatch like a feral cat landing on a guard's back. Her knife flashed, opening his throat. Blood sprayed in a hot arc across a cask label, turning lamp black into a smear. Lisa came down last, hammer in both hands, face set like stone. She swung at the nearest guard who turned toward her, and the hammer caught him in the jaw with a crack that sounded like a millstone splitting. Teeth flew. The guard stumbled, eyes rolling, and Lice swung again. The hammer crushed his temple. He went down like a felled ox. The remaining guards hesitated just a heartbeat, just long enough for fear to creep in. Conrad took that heartbeat and turned it into death. He shot one through the lung. The man staggered back, clawing at his chest, blood bubbling with each breath. Fen drove his sword into another's belly and wrenched it sideways, spilling guts into the slosh. The last guard tried to flee up the hatch ladder, scrambling like a rat. Sela grabbed his ankle and yanked. He fell hard, spine slamming into planks. He screamed. Conrad stepped over him and pressed his boot to the man's throat. "Where is Roderick's son?" he asked, voice flat. The guard's eyes bulged against Conrad's boot. He tried to speak and made only a wet, choking sound. Conrad increased pressure slowly until the man's face turned purple. "Answer," he said, "or drown." The man's fingers clawed at Conrad's boot. His eyes watered. Finally, rasping, he forced out, "Deck! Cabin! Aft!" Conrad released him with a shove. The guard gasped, coughing. Then Sella cut his throat anyway, quick and efficient. Loose ends, she muttered. Conrad didn't argue. Mercy in the wrong moment was just another way of being killed. He climbed back up into the night. On deck, fog had thickened, swallowing the pier. Lanterns swung, and the barge creaked as if waking. Somewhere nearby, a bell began to ring, distant but growing louder. An alarm carried by water. Conrad moved aft toward the small deck cabin, its door banded with iron. Inside, lamplight glowed warm through a small window, and the faint silhouette of a man moved. Conrad kicked the door in. Wood splintered. The door slammed open. Roderick Sand stood inside, coat immaculate despite the rain, hair slicked back, rings glinting. A lantern sat on a shelf, its light painting his face in golden shadow. Behind him, a desk held papers and seals, and a small chest of coin. Sand's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. Then his practiced smile returned, tight, controlled, iron. "Witch hunter," he said calmly. "Breaking and entering again. You're building quite a list of infractions." Conrad stepped in, pistol leveled. "You're shipping ash," he said. "You poisoned Grissenhafen." Sand lifted his hand slowly, palms open. "I am a businessman," he said, voice smooth as oil. "I ship what I am paid to ship. If a label is wrong, blame the clerk. If a cask is misdeclared, blame the dockers. Mistakes happen. Mistakes don't build dosing systems," Conrad said. Sand's smile flickered. "Ah," he murmured, "still chasing your fantasies. Grey ash, secret shoots, conspiracies. You understand what happens to men who speak against charter, don't you?" "They are." Conrad shot the lantern. Glass burst. Oil splashed. Flame roared up the cabin wall, sudden and hungry. Light turned violent, shadows leaping. Sand flinched back, his composure cracking for the first time as heat kissed his face. Conrad stepped closer, the pistol now inches from Sand's chest, the firelight reflecting in Conrad's pale eyes like twin embers. "What happens," Conrad said softly, "is that men who hide behind paper sometimes burn anyway." On deck, boots thudded. Voices rose. More guards had arrived. Guildmen drawn by the alarm bell, crossing the pier in a rush. Lanterns bobbed through fog like angry stars. Conrad grabbed Sand by the collar and dragged him out onto the deck where the night air hit like a slap. Sand stumbled, coughing, eyes watering from smoke. Below, the hold was still. Dead men floated in the shallow water, their blood swirling like ink. Dockside priests arrived next, two of them, in hammer-marked robes, faces grim, drawn by the alarm and the smell of heresy. A small cluster of Templars followed, summoned by bell and rumor. Among them, Conrad saw the unmistakable silhouette of Brother Sergeant Holtz, sword arm splintered, eyes burning with vindictive zeal. Holtz's gaze locked on Lisa, and his mouth curled. "You," he breathed, as if tasting the word. "There you are." Conrad positioned himself between them without looking away from Sand. "Witnesses," he called, voice carrying over the river. "You want truth? Then watch." Sand's smile returned, thin and contemptuous. "This is a circus," he said. "You have nothing. No court will." Liz stepped onto the deck, soaked, hammer hanging at her side. She held something in her other hand, a bundle of papers, torn from the hold clerk's table before blood and water could claim them. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "You authorized it," she said, staring at San with a fury that had nowhere else to go. "You signed!" San's eyes flicked to the papers. For a heartbeat, real fear surfaced. Lisa slapped the papers down onto a wet crate top. The ink was smeared at the edges but readable. A chain of manifests, stamped with guild seals, marked with zone identifiers and dates. And there, clear as a brand on flesh, Roderick Sands' signature beside a notation in neat clerk hand. Ash additive cost saver. Discreet mixing. Authorized. Distribution. Millers and bakers priority. The dock priests stared. The Templars murmured. Even the guild guards faltered, faces tightening, as if they'd just realized they were standing on a noose. San's mouth opened, closed. The iron smile trembled. Conrad grabbed San's hand and slammed it down onto the manifest. "Say it," he commanded. "Say you authorized it." San jerked back, trying to pull free. "I don't know what this is," he snapped, voice suddenly sharp. "Forgery. Lies. That woman." Conrad drew his knife. He didn't stab San. Not yet. He cut San's palm. Blood welled, bright and hot even in cold night. It ran down over the manifest, soaking the signature, making the ink bleed as if the paper itself could finally feel. Conrad pressed San's bleeding hand onto the document. "Witnesses," Conrad said, voice hard. "Look, his seal, his signature, his blood." San's composure shattered. He snarled, trying to jerk away, but Conrad twisted his wrist until bone creaked. "I'm only a businessman," San spat, breath ragged now. "You don't understand. It was just a cut. Just a cost saver. A pinch. There," Conrad said softly. "Say it again. Louder." San's eyes darted to the Templars, to the priests, to the terrified clerks who'd followed the guards and now stood shivering in the fog. He saw the faces that could carry this story beyond the guild's grip. His shoulders sagged, the iron smile finally collapsing into something human and ugly. "It was authorized," San choked out. "I authorized the additive. I signed it. It was..." His voice broke into a furious hiss. "It was supposed to make them buy more. More flour, more bread, more Sigmar, damn you. More trade. Panic makes profit." A silence fell so deep the river's slap sounded loud. Holt stepped forward, eyes gleaming. "Heresy," he whispered. "Corruption. Burn him." The dock priests crossed themselves, faces pale. One raised a trembling hand and began to intone a prayer of condemnation. Conrad did not relax. Confessions could still vanish. Witnesses could still be bought, threatened, drowned. So he did what the guild could not undo easily. He took the manifest, folded it, and handed it to one of the dock priests, an older man, with scarred knuckles and tired eyes. "You keep this," Conrad said. "You make copies. You send them to 3 temples upriver, not 1. If you fail, you share his guilt." The priest swallowed, then nodded, clutching the paper like a relic. San laughed bitterly, blood dripping from his palm. "You think paper stops the guild?" he sneered. "You think..." A cask thudded. A shout rose from the hold. One of the guild guards, face twisted, desperate, had tried to shove a cask overboard to erase evidence in Blackwater. The cask slammed into the hold edge, cracked and spilled. Grey ash rose in a soft cloud, curling up through the hatch like smoke. Conrad felt it instantly, the prickle on skin, the metallic taste creeping into the mouth. Nearby men inhaled, coughed, then laughed too loud. "A Templar's eyes widened, pupils blooming." A dock priest's jaw clenched so hard his teeth squealed. The crowd shifted. Restlessness turned into hunger. Hunger turned into aggression. Holtz breathed in, and his face lit with terrible ecstasy. "Sigmar's wrath," he murmured, voice trembling. "Let it, let it." A young clerk stumbled forward, eyes wild, and swung a lantern at another man's head. Glass shattered, oil splashed. Fire blossomed on wet wood anyway, fed by panic and spilled spirits. The ash cloud thickened, pulled by movement and breath. Men began to shove. Someone screamed. Someone laughed. Conrad saw it in a flash. If he let this become a riot on a barge, the ash would turn it into a massacre, and the guild would later claim the witch hunter started it. He made a choice that tasted like iron. He fired into the air 1, 2, 3 shots sharp, commanding cracks that cut through the rising frenzy. "Back!" he roared, voice like a whip. "Cloth over mouth! Move upwind! Now!" Some obeyed out of fear of the gun. Some obeyed because the dock priest shouted the same order, using their authority like a hammer. The Templars hesitated, torn between zeal and survival. Holtz did not. He stepped toward Lies, eyes shining, sword half raised with his uninjured hand. "The miller," he rasped, voice thick. "She's the spark. Burn her, and—" Conrad crossed the space between them and slammed his pistol butt into Holtz's face. Holtz went down hard, blood spraying from his nose. He tried to rise, snarling, but Conrad planted a boot on his chest and held him there. "Restraint," Conrad snarled, eyes blazing. "You wanted fire? Here, it's yours. Eat it." Holtz's pupils were too wide, his breath coming in harsh gulps. Grey spit flecked his lips. He tried to bite Conrad's boot. Conrad did not kill him. Not because Holtz deserved mercy. Because killing him now would ignite the Templars, and the ash would do the rest. Instead, Conrad barked orders. Fenn and Seller dragged casks away from the hatch, rolling them toward the riverside. Lies tore canvas into strips and shoved them into hands, forcing people to cover mouths. Dock priests formed a stumbling line, pushing the worst affected away from the ash cloud, shouting prayers that doubled as commands. Conrad grabbed the cracked cask and shoved it overboard with a grunt of pain. It hit the water with a heavy splash and sank, grey dust dissolving into black. Not enough. Never enough. But it slowed the spread. Men still snarled and shoved. One Templar punched a priest. A clerk tried to stab a guard. Seller broke a man's wrist and kicked him down into the slosh. Conrad kept the crowd from tipping fully into madness by becoming something colder than rage. A wall. He stood between the ash and the people, pistol in one hand, blade in the other, and made his voice the only thing louder than panic. When it finally eased, when the ash was dispersed enough by wind and thrown casks, when the worst affected were dragged away and bound with rope like rabid dogs, the deck was littered with blood, broken glass, and shaking survivors. Sand sat slumped against the cabin wall, clutching his bleeding hand, eyes staring as if the river had swallowed his soul. Conrad crouched in front of him. "You'll stand trial," he said. "If the guild lets you." San's laugh was weak. "Trial," he rasped. "You think I'm the top of this? I'm a factor, a mouth, He swallowed, eyes glittering with spite. "There are hands above mine, witch hunter, hands you'll never touch." Conrad's expression did not change. "Maybe," he said. He stood and turned to the dock priests, to the Templars, to the trembling clerks. "Quarantine," he ordered, "anyone who ate bread in Grissenhafen in the last week. Anyone who shows fever kept separate. Rope lines, guards, water, vinegar. No more loaves until every sack is checked." The priests nodded, faces grim. The Templars muttered but did not argue, not after seeing ash twist men's eyes. Fen leaned close, voice low. "What about him?" he asked, glancing at San. Conrad's gaze flicked to the river and the dark town beyond, where guild banners still fluttered clean above filth. "Pyres draw crowds," Conrad said quietly. "Crowds become riots. Riots become cover." He looked back at San. "But justice needs teeth." He turned to the priests again. "Bind him," he ordered. "Witnessed custody. If he vanishes, then everyone here knows who took him." San's mouth twisted. "You'll lose," he whispered. "Even with paper. Even with blood." Conrad did not answer. He walked back down into the hold, lantern in hand, stepping over corpses floating in the shallow slosh. The casks that remained sat silent, sealed, lying. At the far end, behind a stack of cargo marked as dye and pitch, a smaller crate sat apart. Newer wood, no guild label, only plain boards nailed shut. Conrad pried it open with his knife. Inside were smaller packets wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine. No wax seal, no guild mark, only a faint symbol scratched into the inner lid, crude, hurried, as if done with a nail. It was not imperial script, not a merchant's sigil, not a temple mark. It looked like a spiral cut by a trembling hand, intersected by 3 short slashes, almost like claw marks, almost like a joke. Conrad stared at it until the lantern flame guttered. He shut the crate gently, as if afraid it might hear him. Above, on deck, the river wind shifted and carried away the last taste of ash. The barge creaked. Men sobbed. Priests prayed. The world stumbled forward, wounded, but still moving. Conrad climbed back into the night, with the lantern's firelight in his eyes, and the knowledge that he had won a battle, proof, confession, witnesses, and that someone else had already planned the next one.